I was backpacking in Arkansas, the Eagle Rock Loop in the Washita National Forest. There is a section of the trail that goes through an area called the Albert Pike Recreation Area. In June of 2010, a flash flood killed 20 people, including men, women, and children. There's a ton of stories online about this event if you want to look it up. So I start my trip at Little Missouri Falls, going counterclockwise. It's 26 miles with some pretty good climbs. You can find a map of the loop on Google Images. So I hiked a fairly long day. If you Google Eagle Rock Loop map, you will find a basic sketch map, not the topo map, just one of the basic ones with the labels of the trails, mountains, and water crossings on Pinterest. At the bottom of the map, there is a single water drop with a yellow circle around it. This just means it's always a wet crossing. There are several yellow circled water drops. The single one at the very bottom right next to the Viles Branch Trail. That is exactly where I was camped, so anyone can go there if you want to look it up and see what I'm talking about. So, that is the Little Missouri River. The water is flowing away from Albert Pike. I'm maybe 4 to 5 miles downstream from where the flash flood occurred. Now, I don't know if this is significant or not to my story, but I'm not ruling it out either. I set up camp at about 4 p.m. for the day. This was November of last year. Fairly cold nights. It was about 26 degrees the night before. I was expecting another cold night in the high 20s. Not a lot of movement around there that night when it was cold. Most animals hunker down. I use a tarp where both ends are open. I have an inflatable sleeping pad and my 35-degree sleeping bag. Now, I'm set up on completely level ground. On my pad, on the tarp inside my sleeping bag, I quickly fall asleep around 10 p.m. after sitting around the fire. Everything is normal all evening, and all night for the most part. Now, you know when you're asleep and you fall in your dream? You get the sensation like you're falling in real life when you tense up and always wake up on impact. Okay, well, I was asleep and I get the sensation sort of where I feel like I'm being dragged out of my tarp by my feet. Except it wasn't by my feet, I was being pulled by my sleeping bag. Like my whole pad with me in it suddenly being dragged out quickly. I woke suddenly as it startled me. Keep in mind, it was really cold, low 30s to high 20s at this point, and I have a 35-degree sleeping bag. So I'm inside my bag all the way with the top closed off by a shock cord. I'm completely inside my bag, covered to stay warm. Now, I'm wide awake and listening for any movement. Everything is still and quiet, except for the river next to me, obviously. That is the only sound I can hear. I didn't peek out my head. I just laid there awake and listening. I sat there for a good 15 minutes listening for any sound outside of the river. I never heard anything. Granted, the river is pretty loud being right there, but there was no movement around my camp at all. So I chalked it up to having that falling sensation when you dream. I figured I must have been dreaming about something and it made me feel like that I fell or something. I went to sleep for 30 or 45 minutes longer, still keeping my ears open but figuring I was probably just dreaming. So for the most part, I just shrugged it off and put my mind off a bit and got back to sleep. Morning comes and I get up and put my shoes on and roll out of bed. I head straight over to the fire to put it and stoke at the fire for first thing because it's definitely cold outside at 6:30 a.m. this morning. I turn back towards my tarp and head over to get my food hanging close by. That's when I noticed it, and I froze. My pad and sleeping bag at the foot end are sticking out from under my tarp, by a good 1.5 feet at least. I can think about how now, as I felt being dragged out from under my tarp the night before, staring at how my bed is from under the tarp. I slowly approach the tarp and look for any sort of footprints. The problem is I don't even see my own because the ground is so compact around there. I double check and I'm not in any sort of slope at all. The ground is completely flat. I really have no idea how this happened, and I know I was startled awake by that sensation of swiftly sliding down the hill towards my feet. My pad with me in it was being dragged out. I quickly had breakfast, packed up and headed out. I was supposed to spend one more night on the trail, but the longer I hiked, the more I thought that what would happen the next night. These thoughts running in my head the entire day as I walked. Could it have been another person? I didn't hear anything. Why would anyone do that to anyone else? How could I have slid down so far? Maybe it was an animal. It couldn't have been. There were no punctures in my mattress and there were no footprints anywhere. Did I just slide throughout the night with restless sleep? It doesn't make any sense. I normally sleep on a slight incline, and I've never slid outside of the tarp before. Was this paranormal? I'm not far from Albert Pike. Could this been some sort of ghost trying to save me from a flash flood horror that it was reliving over and over? All day long, the same things were running through my head. I ended up hiking to my car and sleeping in there that night. The Athens to Big Fort trail was very tough going up over 6 mountains. It was almost dark after I descended the last one. I hiked the last 3 or so miles by headlamp in the dark. I wasn't keen on sleeping on the trail another night after that. Truth is, I've been on that trail a ton and will for sure go back. I've been all over Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, New Mexico, and Colorado. Around 750 miles and countless nights spent in the woods all over the place. I almost exclusively hike solo. I never carry a gun or bear spray. I don't carry a SAT phone or GPS transponder. That is the only weird and unexplainable thing that has ever happened to me regarding camping, backpacking, and the outdoors.
I worked for a state forest service in the tri-state area several years ago in a field location that was 250-year-old farmhouse. The basement was dug and compacted earth. There were large fireplaces in several rooms. A few even had pot hooks in them for heating water and cooking. There was one bathroom that had been installed in the 1940s. Prior to that, there had been none. The floorboards were wide slats of pine, and you could see the hand-forged nails. In some of the areas, they were far enough apart that you could shine a flashlight down through the crack to see the basement floor. Mice and camel crickets were common. They were just a fact of life that we lived with, as was the ancient oil furnace we had in the basement that broke frequently. In the winter, another odd fact was that the dug earth basement, in the farthest and darkest corner, there was a dark room for developing film. I have never even ventured into that room, because it bothered me. I'm going to recall as many of the events as I can in that loose timeline, because it's been 8 years since I worked there, so my timeline might not be exact. I always felt watched there. It was a constant feeling that remained until I got into my car to leave at night. There were often strange smells, sometimes like rosewater and oranges that have warm associations, but sometimes like rotten garbage, even when no trash was present. There was a kitchen that had been slightly modernized on at least 2 occasions. All of the cabinet doors would be shut in the morning, and then as I was upstairs working in the office, I would hear them all open, come back downstairs, and find them all wide open, seemingly by themselves. The moment you walked in the door in the morning, it was as if you felt eyes turning on to you. Our one secretary dealt with this by very loudly announcing, "Good morning," to the existing inhabitants. And she said she didn't necessarily feel threatened, but if she started hearing too many noises upstairs while she was alone, she would loudly say, "Y'all know I don't want to be hearing this. I don't mess with you, so come on, don't mess with me." And she said on some occasions it would stop, but not always. The first time I remember seeing something physically, I usually hear and see images mentally, not with my physical eye. It was about, I don't remember exactly the day, but we had a meeting going on downstairs, and I ventured upstairs to fetch a chapstick out of my bag. My back was to the main hallway, and all of a sudden I heard footsteps to the side of me. I turned and saw 2 shadowy people, one shorter than the other, flash down the hallway into the back office, making footsteps the whole way. On another occasion, concerning footsteps, our secretary and I were in the office on a winter morning, just the 2 of us. and the heat was broken yet again. We sat in the same room downstairs trying to stay warm with a space heater. We couldn't use the fireplaces, they were shut down. We were laughing and talking, and all of a sudden we heard a very loud boot-clomping steps run from the downstairs foyer to the upstairs, and across the hallway, upstairs, directly over our heads to the opposite side of the house. We looked at each other and paused, but at that point, we had been used to these kind of shenanigans, and felt to, if we let it bother us, it wasn't going to be the best scenario, so we tried to be strong. We lost 2 cleaning people though. In the evening, after the few of us had gone home, we never had more than 6 people in the office. We had a cleaning service that came in to vacuum and try to help us with the pest issue by assuring the trash was taken out and etc. Each night, the cleaning man was to fill out a journal of what was left on my boss's cabinet to tell us what he did. After he had been there a while, he told us in the journal that he had heard his name being called while he was using the vacuum. This happened multiple times. He would turn the vacuum off and it was silent. Finally, I guess he was brave, he said he knocked on the wall and nothing happened at first. Then he knocked, and there was a response with 2 knocks back, and he quit after that. My boss had a bad habit of working later in the house after dusk, and I would sometimes work with her. But we would never stay past 6:30 or so. It just wasn't a good idea. It was though that the house had a time, and we didn't want to intrude on that, like a mutual respect. I know that sounds strange. Before she started putting a cap on for evening hours, one night, she was working alone at her desk, facing out into the hallway, when she saw a very tall shadow person pass by the doorframe. Slowly, not running like the ones I saw. She said it had to be 7 feet tall. It scared her so badly. On another occasion, she was working late, and a giant blue orb about the size of a soccer ball, with electrical-looking energy coming off of it, went down the same hallway, past her door, and crashed into a metal file cabinet we had at the end of the hallway. On yet another occasion, this one was in the afternoon, she was working on a project in our large meeting room, which had likely been a dining room at some point. She was engrossed in what she was doing and oblivious to her surroundings when she looked up and locked eyes with a dark-haired man who looked to be in his mid-40s in 19th century dress with gray eyes. She said he looked as surprised that she saw him as she was to see him, and she saw daylight pass through him. He turned to go toward the main stairwell and disappear. She yelled out, understandably startled, and the secretary and I came running in to see what was wrong. None of us saw him again, though we did give him a name based on what we knew of the house's history. In retrospect, I'm not sure if the name was correct, but we tried to be respectful. In that same room, I was simply passing through one afternoon when I mentally heard a woman's voice say, with great agitation, "This is my house." A tired old trope, I know, but there is validity to it when considered in the context that when a canal was being dug in the 1830s near the property, the state was purchasing tracts of land from residents in order to make room for the canal. Later in the 1960s, the state began purchasing large tracts of land in order to preserve them as state parks. One lot being where this house is located. I began leaving a recorder running overnight in different areas of the house, and there were 2 rooms where I recorded the most. One was in the oldest section of the house, that was once a family room, and the other were the servants' bedrooms upstairs, one which was my office. I should note that this house is located in a very rural area. There is a canal nearby that is now used for only recreational kayaking and fishing, and a series of hiking and horse trails, but no city sounds or noise interference from neighbors. When I left the recorder in the downstairs family room, on multiple occasions, I would play the recorder back next day and capture beautiful piano music. It sounded faint, but clearly audible. Classical music. We also experienced a scent of fresh pine in this room for no apparent reason, over and over again. The other, far less happy sounds were that of a gruff man's voice and the sound of at least 2 children crying. I could never make out what the man was saying, and he would be taking a guess as to say what the children were saying, but it always sounded like, "I want my mommy." This is the most troubling memory I have of the house. No one likes to think that children suffered. I began going to the local hall of records for the township and doing some research. I was looking up information on the deeds of wills associated with the various individuals who had owned the house through the generations. Most were handwritten and spoke of chain as length of measure and stone markers or rocks marking where the land boundaries were. I found out the names through the most recent family who lived in the house up until 1967, who by then was renting it from the state. One particular family had been on the property for nearly 100 years and had a chance of finding a living relative. And I did, and contacted her via email to ask if she would like to visit the house, and she did. She was in her late 80s, 88 I believe at the time. But as a cousin of the family who was still living in the house in the 1930s, she visited frequently as a child. Her mind was clear, and I asked her if the family room is where they would set up the Christmas tree. She said yes. She knew that I had been doing some research on the house, and I asked her if her uncle, who lived with the family but was unmarried and died in 1950 or so, played the piano, and she said yes, that he played beautifully. She was a child and young teen there in the 1930s. I didn't want to trouble or scare her with the details of what had been going on in the house. I just treated it like it was a nostalgic event for her. This obviously doesn't explain everything, because there were so many events that happened in the house, including apparitions in clothing from different time periods. But it explained and verified at least two small pieces of the puzzle. We continued to have experiences there, as well as our contractors, such as two young men we hired. They were to repair a flashing on the roof, and they continuously blamed each other for tools disappearing and reappearing in strange, unrelated places. We had to do our own cleaning because we couldn't retain a clean person. On yet another occasion, we had a visitor use the bathroom, where there was a slatted door closet facing the toilet. As she did her business, the closet began to shake violently and the doorknob rattled violently, as though someone were trying to escape from inside the closet. She was horribly scared, and she jumped off the toilet and pulled her pants up without even using the toilet paper. It was often mischievous, odd behavior. A few years later, we lost funding, and I had to move to a different site. But I still see the house when I'm doing extensive bike rides in the area on the Canal Town Path. The house has a field location also lost its funding, so it's been vacant for some years now.
It was during a camping trip at a place here in New Mexico called Oasis State Park. Back then, my church had many children running around, and I made good friends with one of them. I was close enough with them to be invited on a camping trip with his family. It was four of us, his father, his little sister, him, and me. Of course, I brought everything from the Bible. I don't exactly know why. Spare clothes, a small pocket knife, a lantern, my sleeping bag, and my own tent, along with the basic essentials like socks, toothbrush, and toothpaste. Everything I thought I'd need for a good 3-day camping trip. It probably doesn't bear much importance, but out of the kids, I was the oldest at the age of 12. Ryan was a few weeks younger than me, and his sister was around 8. I'm 19 now, so this was several years ago. The first day we set up our tents and proceeded to have a fantastic time. Me and Ryan finished setting up our stuff and walked down to a pond not too far from the tents. The trail to it was literally next to the campsite. I find it important now to mention that yes, there were trees, but not in the same way as a forest. These were small, feeble trees, clearly recently planted, and obviously barely surviving. I only remember them faintly, as I really didn't focus on the shrubbery, short of collecting sticks and watching out for cacti, whenever me and Ryan explored the trail. Anyway, like I was saying, me and Ryan were having a blast, even if we had to drag his sister around because she was bored and couldn't explore alone. We saw a scary yet gorgeous-looking snake that was shiny and black. It was down at the pond getting a drink. Once it was done, it shot off into the brush. Other than that, only two other features of this park were important. The bathroom was up a slight incline along the trail, being maybe 2 or 3 campsites away from ours. That and a bunch of sand dunes built around rocky pillars. Natural pillars, like thin mesas, set ahead of our campsite, maybe 3 campsites away. Beyond those pillars was a fenced-off, very flat and very dry area, if I remember correctly. The bathroom from the front of my tent was to the left, and the dunes directly ahead through a badly kept trail. The first day was fine, and that night we got a campfire going. We had s'mores, told scary stories to each other. Their dad told the only scary stories that night, and I'm sure the man's faith affected the gore level of the story considering we were kids. It was about some abandoned building with ghosts or something, and it wasn't actually scary. I went to bed that night, expecting a cold but peaceful sleep. At some point I woke up and had to use the bathroom. I didn't feel like walking all the way to the bathroom, lazy me, right? So I just went ahead and urinated on a small birch tree that sat literally 4 feet away from my tent. After that I was back asleep in my tent. I don't remember how long I was asleep, before waking up to the feeling of needing to do number 2. It had just rained. I could tell from a tiny leak in the tent, and I wasn't about to go poop on a tree. Well, my little LED lantern wasn't very strong, and now my shoes were outside the tent completely wet. But I needed to go, and this wasn't going to wait, so I decided to just deal with it. Like literally every tent I've ever owned, and probably every tent out there, mine had 2 doors. Not a front and back door, but a zipped shut door with a zipped shut screen door outside that. That way you could see outside your tent, without leaving or having a few mosquitoes move in for the night. So of course, having heard coyote howls, I wanted to check the outside of my tent before stepping out completely, and also being a kid, I didn't realize how easily a wild, hungry coyote could rip through my flimsy nylon screen, yet it still felt safe. So I unzip the tent door and turn on my LED lantern. For a few seconds, everything seemed clear, and the rain had already stopped. Welcome to New Mexico weather. So I decided it would be safe. I began to unzip the tent screen when I heard a very loud howl, like a coyote's, but much, much deeper. If you've ever heard coyotes, they can get pretty high-pitched, so this sound was just weird. It took a moment for my ADHD self to stop focusing on the weird pitch and realize that the howl sounded close, like from the pond close. I didn't even really think to turn off my lantern. I just went to close the tent flap. About a third of the way done zipping the actual tent flap shut, I hear crunching, like when you're on a pebble-filled playground and somebody is casually walking. This is because the tent sites had pebble flooring, just a bunch of tiny little pebbles in a big open circle to make a smoother camp area. Not only was the howl odd, but the footsteps themselves were weird. A fair bit of time between each footstep, and it sounded like they were being dragged with each step, like claws. Well, ADHD me froze in my task, and thousands of ideas distracted me from closing the tent. Sure enough, I took just long enough for the creature in our sight to find the front of my tent. I instantly froze. For the first time in my life, my mind was truly, honestly blank. Sure, I don't think things through, but I never sit and think about nothing. This thing was huge from what my crappy lantern showed. It was big, and a mix of colors on its back, all ranging in random patterns of brown and black fur. It was rather bulky on top, but not like a bodybuilder. More like natural, solid muscle that might have been made from lots of running. Furthermore, it was thin in the middle, and had stocky legs and arms. the legs by the hips stockier than any other part of its limbs. Aside from that, I'd note that its fur was brighter than most Dogman depictions I've seen, like on the muzzle, which was whitish along the bottom. Now, I've done some research on Dogmen since then, and like most depictions and descriptions of it, it had smaller ears and glowing eyes, most likely reflecting my lantern. If you want an idea to base its ears off of, they sat directly on top of it like a cat trying to hear something. At some point it leaned down, and it sniffed the tree before turning to me and looking me in the eye for a moment. But the thing is, when it leaned down, its hind legs made some strange popping sounds, like your knuckles but much louder. I looked into those eyes, though, and I swear I've never been more afraid in my life. Have you ever looked at something, just looked it in the eyes and realized you're the prey? That primal fear that extends beyond normal fear when you realize that this thing looking back at you has all the power, that you are its prey, and it has no discernible mercy. I felt that right then, knowing that no tint wall was stopping that beast if it wanted to crush my skull in its jaws. I never went to the bathroom. I know what some people are gonna say. It was just some weirdo with coyote skin or a fake fur coat. It couldn't have been. The fur wasn't very thick, so I could see the muscles ripple as it moved. Plus the fur was flesh with its disjointed body. Stranger yet, before it moved off into the darkness, it lowered to all fours, and when it did this, its knees made more of the popping sound. The sound of bone hitting bone awkwardly in your body, or like pieces cracking off. Its knees had to disjoint and slide into a different position for it to run on all fours. This was my experience, and some might call it bull, but whatever. My friend and his family heard the howl but ignored it, thinking it would go away, so I know I didn't imagine at least that part. Other than that, the next morning, I had somehow held in my business all night and was only willing to come out when everyone else was awake. There were indeed tracks on the sand dunes that a ranger said were coyote tracks, but other than that, no sign remained, aside from the loud howl that scared any campers that were still awake. If you ask me why it didn't kill me, I'll say I'm not sure. Maybe it was the Bible, maybe it didn't care for the taste of children, maybe it knew the whole campsite would wake up if it tried something. So, for all we knew, it let me live by circumstance alone. Either way, and that's all I got. Since then I've been fascinated by the Dogmen.
My boyfriend and I headed to a state park near us. It's far enough out so there is no noise or light pollution, but it gets dead silent out there quite often. You have to drive a few miles out of town to get there, and it's nothing short of a desert and farmland. Once you pull in, you can choose whether to go to the left to the nearest park side or turn right and drive out to some more past to the bison to the farthest side. This was before the park turned public, so at the time, there was no curfew. It's a really cool park. It actually has trees and ponds. It's a quick getaway from life pretty much and is so quiet and the privacy is nice. We decided to go to the nearest side of the park and we talked and walked around until it got dark. Once it was dark, we laid in the back of his truck, looking at the stars and made out. It was a beautiful summer night. It was 1 or 2 in the morning when we finally decided to leave. We made our way out of the park slowly. We were about to turn and exit when we saw a car entering. There's only one way to enter and exit the park, so we sat and waited. The car looked like one most older people might drive. I didn't think anything of it until I noticed it was driving very slowly. I began to feel uneasy as we waited for this car to pass, and it felt like it took forever. Since the bright lights were on, we could see the car and driver very well. To our surprise, it was an old lady. She had short white curly hair, and very pale skin. She must have been in her 80s. The woman kept both of her hands on the steering wheel. What the hell was an old lady doing this far out of town at 2 in the morning by herself? She was facing forward and stopped her car in front of us before slowly turning her head to face us. This was the point where we froze. The woman's eyes were completely black. Then, just as slowly as before, she turned her head forward. She slowly turned right and drove off into the darkness to the furthest part of the park. I don't remember her headlights being on. We both got spooked and quickly left the park. I was confused by the whole situation. I had so many questions, but I'd rather not ask them. We lived in New Mexico, and we always hear stories of aliens and skinwalkers, but I don't know what that was. Perhaps it was a demon or even a devil. It has been 10 years since that happened, and I still think about it very often. A few months later, we drove out to the dirt roads to get away for a little bit. The sun was just setting. I knew we should have gone home as soon as it got dark, but I decided that we would park and relax. That's when we saw a humanoid figure that was dirty, had very long legs, and it ran in all fours. It ran into the field next to us, which I think was an alfalfa field, and vanished within seconds. I'm aware of many stories in New Mexico about skinwalkers, but I really never paid attention or believed in them. I figured it was a native superstition or the stuff you tell kids to make them stay in at night or give them a good scare. We mentioned what we saw a couple of times to some friends, and they too have stories about seeing weird things out by the dirt roads. We haven't been out driving like that in a while. However, it just seems dangerous. We are unsure if what we saw was a skinwalker or something else completely, but we've kept ourselves away from the state parks and the dirt roads, for the most part anyway. There is an old cemetery located in the Windsor State Forest in Massachusetts called Winnebago. Back in the 40s, it started as a summer camp for kids to hike, play, socialize, and do stuff while their parents were working for the summer break. It could have been up to 24 kids there per summer. The legend goes that there was an old lady as a counselor there who one day snapped and went crazy. She hung 3 girls in the barn and drowned the other 3 in a hot tub. She then killed herself. Let me tell you a quick picture. As you pull into this camp, a small house built in the late 1700s is on the left. After the house is a small shed. A medium-sized barn is located across the driveway from the house, and right next to the barn is a small cemetery with small unmarked gravestones. It is said that the 3 girls that haunt the house and 3 haunt the barn, while the old lady haunts the basement of the house. Inside the house, people have reported hearing laughter and getting small tugs on their clothing, and even seeing shadows popping out around corners. The basement is a different story. In the basement, the old woman's spirit tells you to leave, tries to scare you by moving things around, and people have even reported getting scratched by her. The girls' spirits in the barn, however, are a different story. In the barn, you can hear crying noises and even faint screams. Some have reported hearing them even outside the house. The cemetery is outside. It's like a jackpot of spirit orbs if you're filming or taking pictures. And though it's silent out there, many have reported seeing apparitions and shadows in the cemetery. I myself have been to the cemetery before, a few times. Mind you, each time I was there, I was completely sober. The first time I went with a few friends, we all had flashlights. We stepped out of the car, and before we could even turn them on, I stopped everyone and told them to stand still. It was dead silent. Nothing. No bugs, no birds, no noise from houses around. It was eerily quiet. Unsettlingly quiet. That made me nervous. We walked towards the house and shined a flashlight in the window. We saw a head move out of the window as soon as we did it. The girls with us freaked, but we convinced them to keep moving. We explored the main floor of the house, but we didn't hear anything really. So we went over to the barn. One of the girls, all of a sudden was overcome with sadness and dropped right to her knees, crying uncontrollably. That freaked the rest of us out, so we picked her up and put her in the car and left fast. Keep in mind, we didn't really hear much of anything. We may have seen an apparition in the window, but that was about it. But the presence up there, I can't explain it. It just feels wrong. Like you're being watched and followed. I'm man enough to admit, I'm too scared to return there.
This paranormal experience happened back in the summer of 2013 at Gifford Pinchot State Park in central Pennsylvania when I was around 10 years old, so it was about 4 years ago. The park's geography had a giant lake in the middle, surrounded by heavy woods that went into nearby properties and farms. It was a smaller park in size, with one small bridge for cars that went over the water in a little bay on Route 177. Next to it was one of the canoe launches, where families would launch their boats into the lake. Spending the summers there was quite enjoyable, since it was a true escape from people, unless you saw the occasional hiker or boater that you would only see on busy weekends. It was a foggy Monday morning around 6 a.m. when the sun was just coming up. My father was meeting a friend at the canoe lodge to hand over paperwork or something like that, while me and my younger sister were playing in the ankle-high water near the bridge. Not even seconds after we stepped into the water, I got the uneasy feeling of being watched. It was truly strange as it hit me so fast. Me just being a kid, I brushed it off as my subconscious telling me to be careful. I was so wrong. After a few minutes of playing with my sister, a strange fog rolled in like a thick mist as I lost sight of her. Fear set in as I began screaming for my father, while I searched for my sister. Then everything went quiet. My screaming seemed to be absorbed by the strange fog, as nothing could be heard. I was standing there, aimlessly lost for what seemed like an eternity, until the weird fog rolled away, and I heard the soft giggle from my sister who was standing just a few feet away from me. I began nearly sobbing as I threw my arms around her as she shoved me off into the water. She asked what was wrong with me, as I sat cluelessly in the water. I began speaking, well, almost screaming. "I thought you were lost in the fog." She stood there dumbfounded and asked, "What fog?" I thought I was seeing things. "I was here the whole time, waving to the boy before you." I cut her off. "What boy?" "The young boy under the bridge," she trailed off. I remember a look of horror that was spread across her face. She stood there in a daze for a few seconds before saying, "Isn't the water over there too deep, though?" Every person who lived in the area knew this lake was almost bottomless. In fact, the canoe lodge was only but a shallow bit of land, and a few feet out from it, you would hit smack into a drop-off. It was basically a death trap, as so many people lost their lives over the years as their bodies were found in the water later, while some of their bodies sank to the bottom, I'm sure. I was almost certain she was just seeing things, until I saw something standing just 10 yards away. It looked like a little boy, until I stepped closer. Many red flags went off. I mean, where were his parents? And how was he standing in that water? It was far too deep for any of us. This boy, oddly enough, was naked, and it appeared that his skin was loosely hanging from his abnormally pale body. The eyes, though. I remember seeing no eyes, more like two empty black holes instead. The whole face on the boy looked defected, as you could say. It didn't look like a person at all, more like a creature or a horrifying spirit. Turning back to my sister, I pointed toward the boy and asked, "Is he the one?" She answered, "Yeah." I ended up dragging her out of the water while screaming for my dad to get the car, and we ended up crashing into my dad as he was finishing up talking to his friend. He took one look at us and asked in an angry tone, "What's wrong?" I began breaking down as I said it. "There's something in the water," followed by me explaining what I saw. My sister, who was younger than me, was just standing there pissed, angry that I cut her fun short. My father must have thought I was telling the truth, though, because he ended the meeting early. We climbed into his truck and we drove away. But to get home, we had to drive over that bridge. I looked intensely through the window and saw an outline of a figure in the shallow water, right near where we were standing. I knew right then and there that it was the boy, because we were the last to leave, meaning no one else was around. I learned a few years later that a few young kids drowned in the lake years before. As far as I know, there have been 3. The boy could have been any one of them. I don't see this experience as a death's wish or an angry spirit looking for revenge, but instead maybe the remnant of a tragic end and a child who still wanted to play.
I went to a summer camp when I was younger, and every summer at the camp there was a 4-way long camping trip in the nearby national park. I decided to go on it, and our first day we canoed for almost 7 hours into what seemed to be the middle of nowhere. It was a couple hours before dark when we decided to make camp, and we ported to a tiny bay and disembarked. One of the other kids in our group, there were about 10 of us campers and 4 counselors, immediately decided to head into the woods to collect some firewood, while the rest of us set up the site. Not 2 minutes later, he came sprinting back, shouting that he found a few people in the woods in huts and teepees. I remember laughing along with everyone else. He was sort of a goofy guy, so we thought he was full of shit, until we noticed how serious he still was, so most of us decided to investigate. We slowly made our way through the dense forest, and less than 200 feet from the campsite was a clearing with people milling about. Set up in the clearing were actual teepees, along with a few huts made of branches. At the back of the clearing was a bunch of pickup trucks, and behind them was a dirt track leading away. And not 15 feet in front of us as we emerged from the woods was a huge table with probably 40 people sitting at it. They stopped and stared at us, and we stared back. Then this small, ordered woman with a feather in her hair stood up. She smiled and offered us some food. Our head trip counselor politely declined, then asked if it was okay if we were camping nearby. She said it wouldn't be a problem, and already the other people were getting back at their huge meal. She sat down and we turned and headed back to the shore of the lake. We were all pretty stunned that we were going to be staying the night a few steps away from a lot of random strangers in the woods. But the counselor said it would be fine and finished setting up the camp. We all turned in pretty early though. Now that I'm even older than those counselors were, I don't think I would have had the balls to stay there through the night. The next morning we got up really early and we were getting ready to leave. Suddenly, a voice called out from the woods. The old woman from the table stepped out and asked if any of us had seen her husband. Now, none of us knew who her husband was or what he looked like, and considering we had interacted with these people for less than a minute, it was pretty weird that she would come over and ask about him. Also, I swear this is total truth, she was holding a huge knife. I remember we were all very still, and one of the counselors said we hadn't seen him. She turned and left, and we hauled ass out of there. It wasn't until we got to the next lake that the counselor and my canoe relaxed and acknowledged and fucked up that had been. As if it wasn't enough, on the last night of the trip, I woke up in the pitch black middle of the night and stepped out of the tent. All 10 of us kids shared to go pee. When I was younger, I woke up to pee a lot, but it was the first time on this particular trip. As I started peeing, I heard rustling and noises, and then a short howl. We were camped on the side of a very narrow inlet and extended far back in the main lake, and in the darkness on the side of the inlet you could see glowing eyes. I have almost never been scared, but I bravely finished peeing and slowly, yes slowly, went back into my tent. I'm not religious at all, But that was one and only time that I felt legitimately prayed for those wolves that they didn't come over the water or around us. Sorry if you like the story. When I was 24, I went to Newton Battlefield State Park in Elmira, New York with an ex-girlfriend of mine and one of her friends. We spent the day exploring and visiting all the signs that had information about how it had been a battle site in old wars and had been visited by George Washington as well as other notable historical figures. I found it all quite fascinating, even though I wasn't much of a history buff myself. Anyway, the sun had set about an hour or two prior, and we settled into our cabin. Now, I will say we have beer and weed on us, but up to this point, we had only one beer each and were rolling up our first blunt. I say this so you know the intoxication wasn't a factor, as we were pretty straight at that point. It was dark along the pathway that we were walking, and we all had our backs to the cabin. I heard footsteps coming up the walkway and quickly stashed the illegal leafy substance under my camping chair. As I put it away, and my ex and her friend both heard the steps as well, and looked in the direction of the walking noise, in the distance, light of the campfire, we saw a set of eyes. The noise soon walked past the right side of the cabin before continuing on past and eventually to the left side of the cabin, where it stopped on the side of the cabin we were sitting on. I felt we were busted as I hid the weed under the chair before I asked, "Is there anything I can help you with?" There was no reply, and all I could make out was the eyes glowing with the light of the fire. We grabbed the flashlight I had in my lap and turned it on. I went to point it at the eye, but before I could beam it into the eyes, it turned away, as though it was going to continue on its path. When I finally arrived where this thing would be, there was nothing but the sound of walking continuing down the path. We spent the rest of our night in the cabin, too freaked out at what we saw and heard. I've only ever experienced 4 to 5 paranormal events in my life, and this is one that I question the most. After all, I wasn't alone in my experience this time.